Welcome, everybody, to a new edition of UFO Man Live. My name is Tim, or UFO Man. My co host this evening is Matt Moniz. Matt,
How's it going, guys?
and we have a very special guest tonight. He is an esteemed author, also a UFO lecturer, and has been all over the world representing the UFO topic. Please welcome our esteemed guest, Peter Robbins.
Gentlemen, good to be here.
Good to see you, Peter. We were talking before the show about several things, and one of the things I'm going to ask you first is can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Tell you a little bit about
Your background.
yeah.
I'm sorry, Mike's a little low.
For a good number of years, I have been an investigative writer, self-trained, but my original career was as an artist and a painter, which kind of derailed 40 odd years ago with the return of a repressed memory from childhood. I've joked with people over the years that if I have other repressed memories from childhood, I don't remember them. This was of a very unambiguous UFO sighting over the house that I grew up in on Long Island, New York. I was born in New York City, lived most of my life there. And it was nothing less than five silvery white disc-shaped UFO objects in a very precise V as in Victor formation, close enough to make out regular detailing around the edge of each that my sister Helen and I could only read as windows. I was not a kid who was into this subject other than in the wonderful B movie sense. And I guess I intuited from the adult world that flying saucers and, beings from beyond were real in the movies. And that was it. I had a lot of other interests as a kid. And actually seeing them certainly was the most overwhelming moment of my life. And I had a reaction that I know Matt's familiar with in his years of research and investigation, that I've certainly documented many people over the decades. I call it the checklist reaction. You're living your life, you look up and you see a thing or things, and your mind immediately goes, not a plane, blimp, kite, helicopter, strange reflections from the ground, birds, clouds. What the hell am I looking at? And it really was too much for me. And to compress the story a bit, I basically made myself forget it over the weeks and months that followed very effectively overall. And that memory stayed dormant for more than 14 years, with the exception of one day where it came back for very specific reasons and then got the lid put back on it. And then in my 20s, it returned with a vengeance, and it was overwhelming. I thought I must be going crazy because my logical mind was saying, how could you ever forget an event that was so shattering in your life? But we are able to do that. You don't have to be a mental health professional to understand the dynamics of repressed memory. And I really had a very strong reaction. It overwhelmed me. After calming down a while, I knew that I had a witness. And thankfully, I thought out my call to my sister before I made it. I was living in New York City's Chinatown, where I had a loft where I lived and painted. And I taught painting at my alma mater, the School of Visual Arts. The New York art world was my world. That was it. And it's where I intended to spend the rest of my life to one degree or another. When I called Helen, she lived about a mile north in the East Village, an aspiring poet who made her living to a great degree sewing like one-of-a-kind leather costumes, outfits for rockers. She was a very fine seamstress and a graduate of the French Fashion Institute, among other things. And I was careful not to say what I remembered, other than I have had a memory return from when we were kids. And I'm afraid if I tell you what it is, you'll say yes or no. And I'll never really know if that's what you remembered. So let me set the scene. And basically started to talk about the time of day, how old we were, where we were standing in proximity to us, each other. And she cut me off mid-sentence and said, "Stop, I know what you're talking about." And then told me what I remembered. She wasn't sure whether it was 5 or 6 objects in the sky. I remembered clearly it was 5. It would have had to have been an odd number because it was a V formation. And after we got off the phone, I did my first UFO-related painting and actually painted 6. And when she came over the next day to see it, I showed it to her with my hand over the 6th one. And when I removed it, she agreed immediately that it had to have been 5. But then she said something to me that changed my life completely. You know, people use that phrase, "my life changed overnight." Mine changed in about 30 seconds when she told me parts of her conscious memory, she had never forgotten it, of being taken and remembering just being lifted off the ground, and the roof of our house, you know, which she had never seen before, getting smaller and smaller, and the bottoms of these things getting bigger and bigger. And then a series of, again, conscious memories of being walked through a curved metal hallway by a number of small beings and one large ones. And this was years before the term gray had entered the language. And she described them from her 12-year-old memory as little doctors with big heads, with big black eyes, who talked to me in my head. My sister and I, she passed in 2000, were particularly close. We were not just brother and sister, we were very good friends, roommates for 9 or 10 years of our adult life, both writers and artists to edit each other's work. You know, we're there for each other in many respects through our careers. And I knew she wasn't lying, but I had never heard of anything like this before in my life. I didn't know there was something called ufology. I didn't know there were people who dedicated their life to this study. I didn't know there were UFO conferences. And it was just a tremendous shock. So much so that it became more important to me than my work as an artist, which I have to say I had tremendous resentment for. I've never made my peace with that, actually. But something more important had come along and derailed my absolute commitment to living that life. And over the next years, I had to resolve what became an obsession, and not a healthy one. I didn't, again, know anybody else in the world who was caught up in this subject except for us. And I was very fortunate over the next 2 years in having good fortune to have several very rational, very quality mentors who helped guide me. Also, a brilliant psychotherapist who helped me normalize my understanding of this subject, in that we weren't crazy. The world was. This was a very real phenomena. And here I am all these years later doing this work.
Well, we appreciate the fact that you're in this work. Um, you've lent a lot of credence and credibility to the subject. I've been following you for several years as well, even though I never made contact until recently. But I've met a lot of new people this year, and you're one of them. So I'm glad that you're here.
Me
Matt,
too.
Yes, kind sir.
got a
I would,
question for the man?
I have several, as
Okay.
I'm sure he's aware. Peter, you and I've known each other well over 30 years since the late 80s, correct?
That's right.
Memory serves.
Yeah.
All right. And in that time, I've had a chance to be with you on many occasions over many different places and worked with you on several subjects.
Yes.
Now, I've always known you to be a straight shooter. Okay. You don't pull any punches. You be polite about things if you may not agree, but you don't pull punches. And that's what I like about you. Now, I would like you to be able to explain how you and Bud Hopkins came to meet and what your feelings were about him when you met him and when you started working with him. I hope you understand the question, and I'm sure you do.
I think so. For any of Tim's listeners and viewers who are not familiar with that name, Bud Hopkins is one of the most respected names in the history of UFO studies and was not a, but the pioneer, researcher, and investigator of one of the most complex and challenging areas of study within the whole field of UFO studies, namely the UFO abduction phenomenon. Um, Bud and I met less than a year after I became obsessed with the subject. Um, I, up until that time, had met two individuals in the work that became my first two mentors. One, a retired Royal Hungarian Army staff officer in charge of all photo analysis and audio visual education of the Hungarian army in World War II, who emigrated to this country in 52, Koman von Kavetsky, a wonderful guy who, again, guided me in the beginning and introduced me to a tough, no nonsense, really bigger than life New York City police detective named Pete Mazzola, who was a highly decorated cop and also a crack UFO investigator. I met Bud in the most remarkable way. I was walking somewhere in Midtown Manhattan, went by a newsstand, and I saw the headline of an article in a newspaper that I never before or after associated with the subject, the weekly Village Voice, progressive, mostly political newspaper. And the headline read, "Sane Man Sees UFO." Well, I bought it and took it home and read it. It was a case history that had happened the year before in New Jersey to a working guy who had a shop in Bud Hopkins' neighborhood in Chelsea, in West 16th Street. He owned a liquor store there. Bud was a Scotchman. His brand was Cutty Sark. He didn't go for the fancy things, and every once in a while, when somebody would give him a bottle of single malt, I would be lucky enough to end up with it. But I read the article and have to say it was the best documented and best written UFO single piece I had ever read. I was really impressed, and it was written by a man named Bud Hopkins. He spelled his name with two D's. And the New York art world, which really is the center of the art world, is a small world. I knew there was a late period abstract expressionist by that name, whose work had evolved into more hard-edged work. I'd seen one of his pieces in a group show a few years before. And I went to the New York City phone book and called him. And he picked up the phone, and I introduced myself as a fellow painter who had also become very seriously interested in the subject less than a year before, that I had had a childhood sighting, which really changed my life, and that my sister seemed to have had an abduction experience. And I will never forget his first question to me, which was, "Tell me about your artwork." Well, that didn't go over really well. I was coming out of a minimalist conceptual tradition and era. He was an earlier generation. Nonetheless, he was very interested in Helen's experience, and he agreed to see me. And less than a week later, I showed up at his front door at his invitation, and he invited me in, and we sat at his kitchen table, had coffee, and talked about Helen's experience, UFOs, the art world, New York City, life. And it, it was emblematic for me of those moments in your life where something profound is happening and you don't realize it. I would call it a personal BCAD moment. We all have them. They can be happy, sad. We're all familiar with them. But it was the beginning of a 35-year long friendship, one of the best I've ever had, and the most intensely close personal work relationship that I think I've ever had in my life as well. Bud was still 5 years from publishing his first book, Missing Time, which not only changed the landscape of UFO studies and helped tremendously to legitimize what had been an outsider subject, even in the world of UFOs, namely the abduction phenomena, but added a new phrase to the English lexicon. And I started, well, we began our friendship getting together every few months for coffee or lunch or something. And I worked on and off for years as his studio assistant, something I did with a number of better known artists over the years. And then in 1981, his life changed and he needed help. He was getting so much mail that I started to work part time for him, answering his mail and more responsibility accruing. And then in 87, everything changed again with the publication of his smash international bestseller and one of the most important and best documented case histories to date, on a woman in Indiana uh, whose real name is Deb Jordan Cabell, but who went by the name of Kathy Davis in the book,
Right.
understandably a pseudonym, who remains a very dear friend of both Matt and I. And that's when I, for the next 13 years, really started to work with him more or less full time, part time. And it was one of the most rewarding, exciting, challenging, anxiety provoking periods of my life.
I
That's how
wish
we
I
met.
could have. I wish I could have met Bud Hopkins, but that was before my time. And when I came on the scene, he was already gone, and it was
Yeah,
such a loss. In regards to Debbie Jordan Cobble, I actually know her as well, and she and I speak as well, so we're friends too.
good.
The fact that I got the chance to tell her that when I was younger, I read Intruders and I had the movie for years.
Yes.
And it scared the daylights out of me for some
Yeah.
reason. And I
Well,
didn't know why. But
it it was actually a miniseries
Yeah.
that
yeah,
CBS had optioned. Originally, they approached Bud to option Intruders, but the option was out. It was a time when authors um, were receiving fairly substantial fees for the option, and the option would expire after 6 months or a year, and they would either make the project or not. But you'd be paid for the time that they held on to it. And of course, if it went to film, then you would receive a separate fee. Um, but the option came back. In the meantime, they had option Missing Time. And then, in their own way, because once they have the project, all you can do is hope for the best. But
right,
they hybrided the two stories, added some things. Bud was not fully satisfied with it. However, what was taken from Intruders was extremely good. They had the benefit of hiring Mare Winningham, a wonderful character actress, to play Deb.
yeah,
And by that time, um, Dr. John Mack of Harvard had become involved in the work. So the character of Bud was partly John, partly Bud, and played again a wonderful character actor who we all remember, Richard Crenna. And it
right,
was two-hour sections by contemporary standards. This was all pre CGI, which in many ways I
right.
prefer on certain projects, and it still kicks ass. I think it's still a powerhouse, and very moving, and definitely anxiety provoking. You can find it, some on YouTube. It's a terrible print, and I don't think it ever went to DVD. So there
Yeah,
is no, quality way to watch it that I'm aware of. I think it may have come out in VHS.
Yep, I
Some
had it.
Well,
Yep,
there you go. You should have it transferred to DVD if you haven't already. And
right.
that's, again, even with the graininess, I encourage anybody who's interested in the subject and interested in Bud's work and in the reality of the impact this has on the lives of individuals to watch it.
Yeah, it really brought to light the alien abduction phenomena and what's actually occurring to some people, especially women in general. And that's what the film kind of indicated about the children, the hybrid children
Yeah,
program, the hybridization
that's right.
going on. And a lot of people didn't know that. It was really hard for me at first to wrap my head around it because I
Welcome to
knew
the club.
about, yeah, I knew about alien abduction, but I didn't know about, uh, impregnating human women and then taking it away 3 months later and gestating it on board a ship and then being reintroduced to it like 6 years later. That's just nuts if you
I think
consider it, but it
Matt
is
and
going
I,
on.
for both Matt and I, who met um, professionally, but became good friends over the years. Um, the introduction to that aspect of the subject and the beings that are hybrids, that are part us, part them, you kind of go through a door, and it's not a comfortable one. I remember first in my work with Bud, you have to understand, Bud worked with more than 800 individuals. I know that for a fact because I had privy to all the records. I was his confidant. And back in the pre digital days, every interview and every hypnotic regression that Bud did was audio taped, no video, which I think is very good in some respects because having a camera pointed at you, no matter what your predisposition, can be intimidating. Although, with a good practitioner, people tend to forget about it after a few minutes and get into it, but it's still there. And this, that human aspect of you is wondering how you look, as opposed to just recording some sound. And
Right.
I sat in at either Bud's request or occasionally at the request of the individual on more hypnotic regressions than I recall right now. And part of my job was logging them into a double ledger. And this is, again, pure analog. These were old fashioned ledgers, cross referencing and then filing the tape. Of the 800 individuals that he worked with over the course of his professional life, I was there either, as a bug on the wall or involved to some degree doing the intake interview, spending time with the individual, being the person that actually read the letter and brought it to his attention, and in some cases in depth in the course of a number of investigations for more than 200 of those individuals. So
Well,
at the time, basically he was a real pioneer. And as a colleague of his once said to me years later, in the 70s, ufology, which was essentially a bunch of middle aged white guys who wanted to be taken seriously, to talk about radar returns, lights in the night sky, trace cases where Matt's specialty of doing analysis on organic material that had physiologically in some way been altered with contact with one of these unknown objects or some aspect of that, was acceptable. But as this individual said to me, we were focused on the cars and not the drivers. To talk about aliens, well, you're crazy. You're an outsider. You believe in all that nonsense. And it was Bud who, again, pioneered the area and in great part made it respectable. Also, now more than ever, hypnotic regression is seen as very controversial. There are people who simply reject it offhand, feeling that the practitioners are always and about if impacting, affecting, that they have an attitude or a point of view or an agenda that they want reinforced and that they manipulate the subjects that they work with. Well, I'm sure it happens in some cases. It does. But it's all about the character, the intentions, the humanity, the empathy, and the training of the individual. And one thing about Bud that distinguished him doing hypnotic regression from anybody else in the field that I've ever been aware of, and Matt, let me know if you know of somebody else who is in this category. Bud trained under and qualified under the tutorage of a brilliant psychotherapist, a psychologist named Dr. Aphrodite Clamar. And Dr. Clamar not only oversaw Bud's training, but for 7 years oversaw his casework. He didn't just start out on his own with nobody up the ladder, so to say, to be there for him. And that, I think, is a mark of Bud's character also, that, he wasn't some hotshot who, certified in some class and just went out and did it. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing if the individual, again, is the right individual for the work. But I don't know, Matt, do you know anybody else who, stayed under the tutorage of, or
Not, I know people that have studied under Bud that, carried on his work,
Sure.
like Yvonne and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
Yeah, Yvonne Smith.
yeah, and of course, John Mack, obviously being a peer who understood, but he's no longer here.
Yeah.
You can go back to, other people like Ray Fowler, but Ray Fowler hired other people to do the work. He didn't necessarily do it
Yeah.
himself. So no, Bud was definitely in a class of his own, because he was the type of guy, I want to understand this. In order to understand this, I need to learn to do this. So I learned to do this so I could use this as a tool to understand what I'm trying to find out in a better way.
Yep.
Would I be wrong?
No, I think you've said it perfectly.
Okay.
I got to say thank you to Nick in the chat for the $2.22 super sticker. Thank you very much, Nick.
Now,
Okay.
luckily, I had a chance to be regressed by Bud, and you obviously know my story, Peter. But I found that his technique was quite calming, and definitely wasn't directed. People accused him of, directing people in his questioning in the ways, like, I didn't find that. He just put you in the state, and then from there, you start at one particular point and let you jump off from that point going. And all he did was just follow along as you went into your story. He would help pull you back if things got a little too hairy into where you were going. But I never found him leading like a lot of the people,
No,
claim.
what he did, I observed him sometimes take up to half an hour to allow somebody to fully go under, so to say, to
Right.
fully relax. Also, as should be the case with a practitioner, in the interviews that preceded and conversations, not only with the individual, but sometimes with family members or other witnesses, he went into the regression with a good working knowledge of indeed what had happened. And in cases where the contact, the experience had been traumatic, he stood ready to take that person out or allow them to take themselves out. Also, every once in a while, he did something I found fascinating, which also, and I underwent hypnotic regression with Bud, but not until I was good and ready. And it was a thrilling experience, really. I understood from him and from Pete Mazzola, who I also worked with before him, who had been trained in hypnotic regression for criminal investigation for the New York City Police Department. That's a whole nother story. He was something else. That I was a good subject in that I allowed myself to fully go under and into a deep alpha state. As a result, it was not an intellectual experience for me. I was 14 again. and everything that came with that. And the things that I said were phrases and terms that I would never have used as an adult, but I was 14 again, and that was really quite something. Occasionally, he would do something that Pete would do in a very formal way. He would begin um, a a regression with, "I am going to ask you the color of your shirt, and you're going to tell me the truth, and then I'm going to ask you again, and you're going to not tell me the truth." And it was intentional to calibrate what would come up in running that tape through the voice stress analysis technology at the John Jay Criminal Justice College in New York. At the time, VSA was very bulky technology. Now you can put it on your laptop. But, is your shirt blue? The needle would waver slightly. Is your shirt blue? No. Boom. And that would be part of, what would be used. Bud didn't use VSA, but occasionally he would lead the person away.
Yeah.
And if they were, of course, true to their experience, they would lead them right back to, no, it wasn't that, it was this.
Yeah, Bud made a huge impact in the community, along with John Mack. I want to ask if you have any insight on what led John Mack to actually accept the phenomenon as real. I heard he actually had contact with Bud, and that's how it all came about.
Um, yes. First, I have to say, in the interest of full disclosure, I met John very shortly after his initial contact with Bud. And I love the guy. I absolutely love the guy. He was brilliant and at the same time completely down to earth. Um, what happened was uh, he had a ferocious intellect and grew up with his own demons to deal with, the death of his mother when he was very young, and at the same time, a very privileged growing up. He came from certainly a well-to-do intellectual Jewish New York family with all the right social connections, went to the right schools, and curious about the world around him in overdrive. By the 60s, John, as a young, brilliant psychiatrist, had found that the Western model of seeing the world was not serving him and looked east, as many of us did in the 60s. Bud, on the other hand, was absolutely grounded in the Western world, completely unmystical, absolutely pragmatic. Um, One of the smartest and best read people that I ever knew. One of the things that I loved about Bud was we could talk about books all day, or the history of this civilization or this country, or the New York art world, or the architecture of the 19th century in New York City, or the restaurants. He read the New York Times, the New York Review of Books. Um, he was absolutely a human sponge taking it all in. He had a BFA in painting from Oberlin. I had my BFA in painting from the School of Visual Arts. And John, again, his thinking was not grounded in the Western world, so to say. He was open to any and all possibilities. Um, and he heard at a certain point in the early 90s, I think it was, that there was this painter in New York who felt that aliens, for lack of a better term, I've never really felt comfortable with it. I usually find myself saying other intelligences were abducting people. And the euphemism used to be experimenting on them. Well, they really weren't experimenting. They had a program, and they still do, I think, in effect, and they're just following what that program is. I should also say
Right.
here, and I know Matt agrees, in that it's often something that people argue about because they're kind of have the wrong model. Basically, we're dealing with probably a myriad of other intelligences. Some of them dimensionally oriented, others, very 3D. And
Column
a
A, column
yeah,
B,
yeah,
column C.
there you go.
Yeah.
A percentage of these other intelligences are represented by advanced technology from parts unknown, coming and going with impunities, probably since time immemorial. But, we date our modern era of UFOs to 75 years this month and last month. We're right at that moment. Matt
Right.
was smack in the middle of it in Roswell earlier this month. I last week at the huge International MUFON Symposium held in Denver, and the so-called Kenneth Arnold sighting of June 24th, 1947, in Washington State, set it off, with Roswell
Right.
being the bookend a week later. And
Right.
people argue about, are they good, are they bad? Um, Wrong questions. That's what we're dealing with here. What we right now in this conversation are dealing with is those intelligences involved in abduction, who generally appear as what we now euphemistically call grays, and missing pregnancies, hybrids, things that are very troubling, very challenging, and incredibly real as we are and the chairs we are sitting on. And this is, for some of us in the work, I would say Matt and myself are two perfect examples. We no longer have the luxury of disbelief.
Hmm.
At the same time, let's differentiate here between skepticism, which is rational, important, and crucial to people like Matt and I, and debunkers, a very interesting word that I think I love language and the origin of terms. The earliest use of that word that I've ever come upon is in the so-called Robertson panel report, where the CIA pulled together a number of people in 1952, was it, Matt, or 53? I think
50.
50. Yeah.
I would say Robinson panel was, I believe, 1953. Yeah.
Right. February, including Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who at that time was working for the United States government under the auspices of the CPA as a debunker, and with the wonderful front of his academic credentials, which were sterling, being the head of astronomy studies at Northwestern University. He had an epiphany, change of heart, I think in part brought on by a confrontation with the late, great Dr. James McDonald, a brilliant atmospheric physicist who was one of the most courageous and decent and intelligent people in the work, who took it upon himself to try to bring some semblance of reality, of the seriousness of this subject, to the greater scientific world, and was crushed in the process and died sadly of a self-inflicted complications from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But, allegorically, he was murdered on a certain level by the debunkers. Anyway, the word debunk comes up in that Robertson panel report, and I've never seen it earlier. To go off on a tangent, I know the word bunk, like that's a lot of bunk. That goes back to the 19th century. I remember my grandfather using that term. But with Dr. Mack, he had heard that there was a painter in New York who believed aliens were abducting people. He's a psychiatrist. He wanted to meet the guy because he knew he was crazy, of course, on some level. And as he told me, on his next meeting with Bud, when I was there at the studio, and we immediately hit it off in a way that took me aback. Here he is, a Pulitzer Prize winning, distinguished Harvard psychiatrist and clinician, co-founder of the psychiatric unit of Cambridge Hospital in Boston, who looked up to me because, with my BFA and my sister's experience and years of working with Bud, I was an immediate colleague and somebody who we just got along famously. But he said, of course, you know, Bud basically opened his files to him, and it was the biggest paradigm shift in his life, meeting Bud Hopkins. The two agreed to disagree on a number of things over the years, but they adored each other on a certain level, had tremendous respect for each other. And they did one public dialogue together. I don't know if you were there, Matt. I wasn't able to. It was at Faneuil Hall
In
in
Boston.
Boston, where the two of them were on the stage discussing this subject with a live audience. And it's available. You can chase it down on YouTube. But
You'll find me in row 6.
it may be the most breathtakingly intelligent exchange between two great minds on an incredibly challenging subject as has ever been recorded. And John's loss was a terrible blow to both of us.
Yes.
Again, I really love the guy, and I was only about 50 miles away in England when he was killed by a drunken driver. And I learned in a way that was very shocking to me, which was I was in Suffolk at the time, not surprisingly, at the Rendlesham Forest with friends who lived nearby. And I was coming into London the next day for several days and staying with my then good friend Nick Pope. And I called Nick that day to basically just confirm that I'd be coming. And, started out when he picked up the phone, some wise guy remarked, and he was quiet for a minute. And he just said, "You haven't heard." I said, "What?" And he said, "John Mack was killed by a driver." And I was shocked. And my first thought was, and I am not a conspiracist, I don't see plots behind every tree. But my first thought was, Jesus Christ, it's not out of the question that this was intentional. We had waited for years, in a way, for somebody of Mac's stature and credentials to be a voice in the work. He
Yes.
was one of a kind. Nobody had his credentials at that moment in time. And I thought immediately a lot of people would assume he was murdered. And I took it upon myself over the weeks and months that followed to do my own investigation, to get hold of the court records, um, all of the facts surrounding it, and the background on the driver, who was on his 5th suspension, was an alcoholic, did not have a license at the time. And even if it had been choreographed by your classic, 3-man intelligence hit team with an observer on the roof, and the driver had been totally Manchurian and candidated out, to have him in his lorry and his truck at that right moment as Mac finished giving a talk to the T.E. Lawrence Society. His Pulitzer Prize was for a psychiatric biography of Lawrence of Arabia. And he had given a talk, and it was so well received that they asked him to continue the talk after a meal break. And it was random beyond belief. There was no way, a potential assassin hit team could have worked out the details. Again, you've got a guy in a vehicle in a busy traffic situation, and he did something that a lot of us Americans do in the UK, and that I almost did again in May when I spoke at a conference in Hull, but in London later in the week with my sister Anne. I looked the wrong way as I was about to cross the street, and she basically grabbed my shoulder, and a vehicle came right by. I think that's what happened with John. I miss him every day, like Bud. He also had a wickedly wonderful sense of humor, and we had some wonderful times together.
Did you know Stanton Friedman?
Stanton was my last major mentor in my life, and somebody who I didn't know well at first. I first heard Stanton speak in the most privileged way possible, which was at the United Nations General Assembly Special Political Committee meetings to attempt to establish a permanent UFO study committee at the UN. It took place in November of 1978, when I was a few years into the work, and had been invited by my first mentor, Coleman von Kavetsky, to help edit a paper that had been requested by the then Secretary General of the UN, who he knew in passing, along with my first contemporary UFO colleague, the great, now pretty much retired UFO scholar Antonio Huneeus. Again, I'm a self-trained investigative writer, Antonio was a graduate of the Sorbonne School of Journalism. His father was a diplomat from Chile, associated working for the United Nations with the United Nations, and we worked on this paper, which was very visionary. Coleman, as a military scientist, had a great concern that UFOs coming in over Soviet or American airspace and not identifying themselves might be misinterpreted as enemy aircraft and have the potential of setting off a war. And I sat up in the gallery and listened to Stanton Friedman and Dr. Jacques Vallée and Dr. Alan Hynek and a very important UFO witness, fairly recent back then, Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Coyne, who had been involved in a UFO helicopter incident over Ohio not that long before, where a fully articulated oval came in over their craft. The pilot went into a dive, but the UFO pulled it up 1,800 feet while they were trying to dive. Anyway, that's how I first heard Stanton. It was another 10 years. I'd heard him a few times after that at conferences, but, it was basically, thank you for your talk, Mr. Friedman, and, would you sign this paper for me? In 1987, we really connected and became friends and colleagues after that, and he was a guiding force in my life. And we lost him it was almost 3 years ago. One of the nicest people in the world, a tough son of a gun in terms of debate, a rationalist, and a true champion of the truth regarding that aspect of UFO studies revolving around advanced technology from parts unknown and beings. One of the greats, one of the true greats forever.
I have to state one thing about Stanton. I never met him, but he knew of me, which is odd. Being that I had a friend that was working for MUFON as a director, and he was over in the UK setting up flyers for a MUFON symposium, and he ran into Stanton. And Stanton came up to him and asked him, "Hey, do you know who UFO Man is? Are you UFO Man?" And he said, "No, but I know who he is." And that's how he got introduced to me. And Stanton told my friend, his first name was Chuck, and told Chuck, "Tell him that I'm one of his anonymous subscribers to his channel."
Very
So
nice.
I had, while he was alive, he was a subscriber to the UFO Man channel. Very, very proud of that fact. The fact that he actually took the time to watch what I was trying to do. And I miss him. Yes, I do. And I wish I could have met him personally, but I never got the chance.
He was a great man and a great guy. I would say that about John and Bud, all three very different individuals from very different backgrounds and three of the finest contributors to the work. The moment that I really connected with Stan was in 1987, which was the 40th anniversary of Roswell and Kenneth Arnold sighting. MUFON had their yearly international symposium, which takes place in a different city each year, in Washington, D.C. at American University. And it was there that Stanton gave a paper that really redirected me professionally. I had been working for Bud on and off for a dozen years, had my own articles starting to be published, was speaking occasionally at conferences, and he gave a paper called The Secret Life of Donald K. Menzel. Menzel was the first establishment skeptic, a debunker, who, once again, like Dr. Hynek, before he became one of the good guys and a truly heroic figure in his own right. And it was wonderful meeting his son, Paul, last week for the first time. Another brilliant mind, following very much in the footsteps of his dad, that Menzel was the head of astronomy studies at Harvard, so major academic, but was quietly working away, I think very much at the behest of forces within the United States government. And the man they trotted out and quoted starting in 1947, no, not that early, um, but wrote a number of books about UFOs from the debunking point of view, and was essentially the mentor for Philip Klass, who went on to become the best known and most destructive of the debunkers. Anyway, what Stan had done, being a brilliant researcher and investigator in his own right, was get hold of and go through all of Menzel's papers at Harvard, uh, in the National Archives, and then with permission of his widow, all of his personal papers, and was able to establish beyond any reasonable doubt that he was living this double life. And I remember sitting there in the audience thinking, that's what I want to do. I want to be able to write a paper like that. I want to follow that kind of rational approach. I am a geek on a certain level. I really like being out in the field, being with people, hands on. But I also really like that stuff that for a lot of people is just boring to death, of going through archives and libraries and out of print books and declassified documents and finding, where you can put the pieces together that maybe somebody else didn't before you. That's a great feeling. And it was that talk that inspired me to, that was also the summer that the whole MJ12 subject broke out. Um, I felt like a bit of an insider because I received a copy of the Eisenhower briefing document, which I'm convinced is absolutely real, as was Stan. I have some question about a lot of the stuff that followed, but I am convinced that that was real. And of those 12 individuals, zoned in on several of them and decided I was going to write a paper and do a major research project on one of them. And that turned out to be our former First Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. And that project I pursued on and off for 30 years. And several years ago, did my own documentary on it, have lectured on it extensively, and feel I have made a case that what we, the public, what history was told, that he committed suicide after a profound nervous breakdown. And certainly he did have that breakdown. He was actually murdered. And he was an early casualty of the UFO cover-up, and somebody who could not be allowed to live as far as certain key people around Truman were concerned, because the potential of him becoming the greatest security threat in the history of the Western world from their point of view was simply too much. And so he had to go. Anyway, where Stan and I became real friends, though, was several months later. I had actually had my first Philip Klass experience at that conference as well. I was on a panel discussion with the aforementioned Deb White-Cabell, with Whitley Strieber, with Dr. David Jacobs moderating about the abduction phenomena, in the role not as somebody who has had the abduction experience, but who's somebody who grew up with a sister who had, and Bud Hopkins' assistant. Bud was not at that conference. Anyway, Philip approached me after the talk. He sat in the front row taking pictures and egged on Whitley Strieber to such a point that Whitley kind of exploded at him and accused him of this, that, and the other thing. And I think it was one of the happiest moments in Phil's life. He just glowed like he was what he was, the center of attention at that moment. And he approached me very respectfully. I should have known it was overly respectfully. Could I do an interview with you? I'm fascinated by your sister's experience. Essentially suggested maybe I've been wrong about all this. And I did the interview, and he turned it on its head. And it was, he reduced my sister and I to two young people who wanted to feel special, and so confabulated this experience. And it appeared in his book, UFOs, A Dangerous Game. It was one of my early deep connections with Travis Walton, in that our chapters were right next to each other. And I was doing a Canadian television show called Lifetime, where he and I were guests some months later. And I remember sitting in the green room just fuming over this. And at a certain point, realized somebody was in front of me and looked up, and there's Stanton Friedman with a very furrowed brow. And Matt, he could really furrow that brow.
Oh,
He looked very concerned. And he said, "What's wrong?" He immediately knew something was, and I told him the story. And as I did, his face changed from concerned and furrowed to kind of a smile. And he stuck his hand out and he said, "Congratulations. You're nobody in this work till you've been attacked by Phil." So, but I love the guy. And again, you can't go wrong, I think, reading his work, listening to his talks. Certain people in this field, I think, will always be valuable. You can read the work of Donald Kehoe 70 years now after it's been written, or listen to talks by Dr. James McDonald, and they just shine with intelligence, with clear observations, and with a spirit of rationality that, frankly, is missing from a lot of present day people involved in the work.
You know what's strange is that the Pentagon came out and said, "Oh, we can't find any of the information between, say, 2004 and 1947 because it's been misplaced." But that's not necessarily the case. There is so much information out there that they could look into it, but it seems like they're doing the estimate of the situation from Project Sign. They're following the same playbook. National security threat. Don't know what it is. We're going to put it in the other bin. We're just going to let it go. So, in regards to what you're saying about all these people and all these books and all this knowledge, they really need to dig into it. And that's what is missing in my mind in today's current UFO phenomenon research.
Well, you used the term that the government has trotted out, for decades of national security. I prefer the wording national insecurity. And the fact is, of course, that material is available and it's classified, but they've been able to work the system brilliantly well, because in the summer of 1947, the American people, and by extension the Western world, were brilliantly conditioned to know that there's nothing to this. It's all explainable in conventional, even if conventional, unconventional terms. But, flying saucers and little green men, ha ha ha. It's, if you believe that stuff, you're either, some poor loner who's looking for, something to make them feel special in life. You're a cult member. You're a con man. You're delusional. You think you can make money by, putting this out there in the world. It's totally counterintuitive, and been a subject that I've actually pursued for a long time, with the understanding that something set in motion, something very intentional, UFO ridicule, and its power has been tremendous in keeping the subject at bay up until about 5 years ago, when I can't say it was a series of articles in the New York Times in December of 2017, or whether that simply happened at the same moment that the walls were crumbling to a degree. 2 articles written by 3 terrific journalists, Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper. And nothing has been the same since then. And we all are aware of that. And it's healthy. It's good in that the ridicule factor is dissipated tremendously. The government is now conceding there is something to this subject. We have the media that is now treating the subject with respect, and major politicians who are looking for more answers. I think it's also important to note that in the media and in Congress, we are seeing the same interest and serious take on the subject on both the left and the right, and the far left and the far right, which is a very good thing. At the same time, and I think Matt would agree,
Yeah.
this is kabuki. This is Gilbert and Sullivan. This is a stage show. Gee, they came out with a report, a year ago in June, and wasn't that exciting? No, it was totally controlled. It was the most minuscule amount of information that was being released, but it looked good on paper.
It was
And
dipping the toe in the water to see how it felt,
yeah,
how it would garner reaction, which way the wind would blow.
yeah. One thing we can expect if the government, to use the sweeping euphemism, has its way, is years of reports, each one being a little more staged, forthcoming. Like, oh my goodness, look what we now think we know. What you will not see is any reference, any acknowledgement, any even hint of acceptance or mention of anything remotely exotic. Crashes and recoveries, back engineering, um, missing pregnancies, hybrids. Um, it's There is still that factor of a fear of mass panic, a fear of the unpredictability of what will happen in certain corners of the Western world if it's simply understood that there are power sources that go beyond our understanding or ability to use. And if we were to trot them out and start to employ them, the panic and the economic downturn, to use the most gentle phrase, in the petrochemical industry, nuclear industry. Um,
Coal.
one of the things that is also referred to as, people of faith will immediately, be running around like chickens with their heads cut off, thinking the devil has taken over the world. I don't think that is the case, except, of course, with extremists. There are religious extremists in all religions. And in
Right.
some cases, people are severely challenged by this idea that we're not alone in the universe. If we're made in God's image, who the hell's image are they made in?
But then it also says he made the heavens and the earth. So what are the heavens? Plural. That would
Well,
be
there you
space.
go. That's a rationalist approach.
And
And
dimensions.
an argument that I put forward with, I will say, friends or acquaintances who are extreme, in my opinion, with respect to their religious beliefs, that do you feel that the miracle of God's creation stops at the ionosphere or halfway to the moon or, to Pluto, or just continues out to way into the extremes that we're now seeing more clearly than ever with the wonderful deployment of the James Webb Telescope and some of the imagery
Yeah.
that is, on an aesthetic level, so beautiful and so shocking in terms of what we're trying to wrap our heads around, of light years beyond counting of images of galaxies coming to us that burned out billions of years ago.
Right.
I, I can say the words, but all the fuses in my fuse box in my brain blow as I do.
I remember something I was taught in early catechism when I was a child. And I had asked about, what about life out there? And this particular priest quoted something about Moses being on the mountain. And he asked, about his people. And the quote from God, and I'm not sure where, somebody who's more Bible literate than me can probably find it. God basically said to him, I'm paraphrasing here, that you are one of my many people, and this is only one of my many worlds. So, to quote God, you ain't alone.
Yeah,
So,
it is actually a fact, that it is written several places in biblical texts, including a lot of the books that were removed by the Vatican, which I think they're actually controlling because it does indicate
yeah.
off world visitation and interaction, and they don't want the populace to know because they can control them better. Just my
This
opinion.
is a complex and interesting subject, Tim. No religion no organized religion in the history of the world has had a more calculated, controlling hierarchical structure than the Roman Catholic Church. And up until 25 years ago or so, any suggestion of what we're talking about of, off-world intelligence visiting Earth was classified as demonology, or, the minions of Satan trying to lead us away from the true teachings of Christ. But something happened, again, 25, 30 years ago, with the higher ups in the Vatican, where they began to transform their position. For many years, a ranking cardinal, Cardinal Balducci, was deployed in the public, first in Italy and then around the world, as the Vatican's spokesperson on, yes, the very real possibilities of visitations of other intelligences, beings from other worlds or what have you, as a reality. And even now, even more so, the Roman Catholic Church is leading the way to instilling in its followers that this is very real, that it is going on, and that it is what it is. Um, I think other religions, to greater or lesser degrees, have a built-in understanding of acceptance of things beyond what we're traditionally given. I would say Buddhism and Hinduism are two of them, where basically we are open to any possibilities. Hinduism has hundreds of gods and a history of flying machines recorded in the Vimayanas, um, from parts unknown and ones that were constructed in ancient times. Um, Reform Judaism is certainly open to the idea, and that part of the world is changing in a good way, I think.
A lot of tribal elders among Native Americans
Oh,
have
yeah.
actually come up with many
Yeah.
stories of visitation and interaction with
Yes.
off-world visitors who have actually taught them things like
It-
hunting and farming and art.
Without question, in Native American cultures, the star people are a very real part of their tradition and understanding of the world and the cosmos. My late dear friend Clifford Mahuti, who was a Zuni tribal elder and who sadly left this world a few months ago at the age of 78, um, was somebody who shared these traditions and these understandings with the non-Indian world. Um, but oh yes, without a question, and I think we can say the same about other um, native cultures around the world.
I have to say this, my logo was designed after the idea of star people. That's why there's a star in the head of the alien face. And it came from the idea that tribal elders had stated that there were star people within the Americas visiting here. So this is where it comes from, just for everybody's trivia knowledge. Matt, you got a question for Peter?
Yes, I'd like to touch briefly about Rendlesham. What would you like to say about, the incident without getting into, we'll call it muddy waters?
Well, for anybody that isn't familiar with that term, it's the Rendlesham Forest in Suffolk, East Anglia, in southeastern England. In December of 1980 was the backdrop for a series of what we will call UFO incursions that happened over several nights with different witnesses to different aspects of these incursions. There are two major. Well, Suffolk is quite a militarized area and has been for 100 years. There are most of the witnesses that we have were United States Air Force, but also a good component of civilian witnesses. And the case first captured my imagination in 1983 when the story broke. In 1987, I undertook with a co-author to write a book about it. And it brought me back to England probably 7 or 8 times over the next 9 years to do the research. And since then, definitely more than that, I was back in the UK in May to give a series of talks at a terrific conference sponsored by Outer Limits magazine in the great city of Hull. And I think that was somewhere between my 20 and 25th trip to the UK. In any event, there is no question that a series of events happen. And to this day, I cannot tell you exactly what it was. There is certainly reason to suspect that it may have been off world beings in advanced craft, that it's certainly not out of the question that there was a certain amount of, in the terms of the former Rendlesham Deputy Base Commander, Colonel Charles I. Hall, that men were messed with, that stuff was implanted in the minds of key individuals, that there was a certain amount of what we, popular culture call brainwashing going on, that some of the information that came down to us was not true, overtly not true. And that at the same time, with people like Jim Pennison, certainly one of the authentic witnesses, that a download of information happened into his mind that has very real significance. Also, John Burroughs, a very credible witness who was involved with Jim on the first night. Work goes on the case. I am no longer involved in it, but it's very real. I hope we get to the bottom of it, or at least learn more about it with the passing of years. And there's a whole new generation of researchers and investigators, a number of good quality books on the subject. Certainly part of the book that I co-authored is worth reading, but it is so mixed in with confabulations, exaggerations, and outright falsehoods on the part of my co-author that it makes for complex reading in that sense. I would say that the book, which is called Left at East Gate, has several hundred annotated footnotes, each one fact-checked by me and each one that I stand behind, as well as my personal account, where it wasn't directly informed by my co-author when I believed his full account. But it's a very important series of events in the history of UFO studies, and far and away still Great Britain's best known and, to a degree, best documented UFO incidents.
Don't they?
I would
Don't
definitely,
they?
and if I may, Peter. Now, I know you from writing back then, and I worked with you, and I was obviously familiar with your co-author. But what you wrote in terms of your background of it was fine, and for let's say what we know happened. Your co-author basically co-opted a lot of the other people's stories and wrote himself into it. So, what the story itself, the whole story about Rendlesham itself, is legitimate because you have so many other people
Yes.
witnessing this and that, and there are physical results. That I'll give you a good example. The field where I did the soil sample testing. Well, your co-author may not have actually been there, but I talked to the other people that did witness it and said, yes, that is the spot where it came down. So the reality is checked, and it is still an active, investigation going on by other people.
You bet.
And I am going to reanalyze some of that soil sample for you, and actually for everybody. Yeah.
And
Well,
we're gonna actually have him show that soil sample online. Do you have it right? Do you have it right there
I have it within reach. Yeah.
within reach?
Okay.
Okay, this is a soil sample from where exactly?
Uh,
Well, it's in a field called Capel Green, and these are samples that I personally took from the area in question, from the edge of the area in question, and
edge
from
of the
out in the
area,
field as a control.
and the control,
Oh, my little
and from
film
the.
canister.
Yep, I still have them.
They're very
The
valuable. One of the
pieces of
reasons
Betty Hill's dress,
uh,
parts of the tree from Travis Walton's experience. I got all kinds of goodies. But
uh,
I have access now to a lot better laboratory equipment. And
yeah,
what I'm going to be doing, and I had a chance to sit down, for a good day and a half with Nick Pope, and he agrees that it should be a good idea to revisit, what I did independently, aside from, because he agrees that, that area where Halton, Burroughs, and Bustins
separate.
and Sark go down is still part of the lore, and it would be nice to check it. I'm also going to be doing some other testing from somebody that you and I know, so I got a lot of stuff coming my way this year.
It's great, man.
Yeah, plus he's co-hosting on UFO Man from time to time,
Yeah.
which is really cool. We really like the fact that he's a scientist, has that viewpoint, and brings it to the table. Um, I was going to say that in regards to Rendlesham, it was referred to as Britain's Roswell, right?
Yeah, it was and still is, but there's no um, comparison in the cases or events. It's simply called that because Roswell is the United States and maybe the world's best known UFO incident, and the Rendlesham incident is Great Britain's best known UFO incident.
Right. Okay. Matt,
Yes, sir.
um, tell him who we got coming up on the channel coming up soon that he knows really well, unless you don't remember. Travis Walton
Yeah.
is
Okay.
coming
Yeah.
on the channel.
I was going to say you
He
told me several. It's like which one?
Yeah, I actually spoke to him like we are now, camera to camera, at Roswell, and he said he's coming on. So everybody in the chat room, everybody who's listening online, we are going to have Travis Walton on this channel. Um, a, a good friend of I'm sure Peter, and I know of Matt and Tom Reed. Also, we're having Linda Napolitano. She's going to do a rare interview with Matt and myself and Tom on the channel, which is really nice because we can talk about the Brooklyn Bridge abduction.
Yeah, I would say, when I referred back to being a part of several hundred cases that Bud worked on, in many cases it was incredibly minimal. However, the incident that I was most involved in all the years I worked with Bud, was the 6-year long investigation of Linda's experiences. And we have remained friends ever since. But that case, I work regularly, different aspects of it for 6 long years.
Linda's very nice. I actually wrote her over a year ago asking her for an interview, and she said she wasn't doing them anymore until I met Matt. And Matt said, "Well, tell him what you said, Matt."
Yeah, it's like I've known Linda, as you know, Peter, for a while. I ate at her house, looked out the window she went out of, and in case people do or do not know, I'm also an experiencer. So her and I have been together doing things, and it's like there's a legitimate show that will treat you right and is not going to be an ambush. Would you be so kind as to come on our shows? And she said, if you're there, yes. So I
Yeah.
was able to bring her out of the shadows to come in.
And
Very-
before he did that, I actually when I contact people, I usually keep in contact with them even after interviews. And I sent her a Christmas card this last year, and she responded. So hopefully that helped. I don't know. But she's a super nice lady, and I hope to have her on and have a great interview. But I want to say this to you, Peter. I really respect the fact that you're doing so much within ufology, even though it is not your primary field of interest.
Well,
Uh,
it has by de facto become just that over the decades. And it's funny in that if you do relatively good work, and when you fall on your face, you don't try to hide it, uh, and you tell the truth to whatever degree you can. And for me, a lot of the questions that I get, the answer is, I don't know. I don't know. Well, what's your opinion on it? I don't really have an opinion on that. What do you mean you don't have an opinion? Well, I don't know enough about it to have an informed opinion, and I'd rather wait till I know more to have an opinion than have an opinion based on nothing. Um, Thank you for
right.
that, though, and I appreciate that.
Yes, you are highly revered in this community, and I consider you a legend. So thank you for coming on. Matt, do you have any last questions for Peter?
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing now and what you plan to do later? And is there any places that people are going to be able to see you?
What I'm going to do right now after we get off the air is have dinner,
Oh,
but I know that's not exactly what you wanted to know. Um, I just finished what I consider an important research project and delivered the results of it last week in Denver, a paper on the origin of UFO ridicule. How did it come to pass that one person saying to another, I saw something in the sky I couldn't identify, resulted in 70 years of people immediately assuming that that individual was mental, some loner looking for attention, a mystic, a cult member, somebody looking for fame or attention, somebody looking to make money. It makes no sense at all. How did it happen? How did it come into play? And I presented my findings on that. Otherwise, working away on a book manuscript, be out sometime next year. Next appearance will be at a wonderful event that I look forward to every year, like almost everything on everybody's calendar has been pushed back for 2 years, which is the Exeter, New Hampshire UFO Festival and Conference, which I'm very proud to be a co-founder of, and which this year will feature Kathleen Martin, Ralph Blumenthal, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who has written so eloquently about the UFO phenomena for the New York Times and other venues, and should mention, because this came up earlier, is the author of what is now the definitive biography of Dr. John Mack, a book called The Believer that I encourage everybody to read. And when Tim said earlier you knew John Mack, I thought to myself, the way we use language, you know somebody, you think you know somebody, you're friends, you have certain things in common, but when you learn about their full life, you realize how
You
little
really
you
did.
knew.
Yeah, you
And
really did
reading
know.
it was a very interesting experience. I think it was the first time in my life that I read a full, grown up biography of somebody who not only I considered a friend, but I'm prouder of the fact that they considered me a friend. And I learned so much about John. Um, Otherwise, moving ahead on a number of smaller research projects, uh, looking to continue to be out there on the conference circuit, as well as presenting papers, continuing to do virtual get togethers for educational institutions, startup groups, uh, different UFO and paranormal research groups, MUFON groups. The main thing is for me, I see myself as a worker in this. I'm no prima donna. We're all in this together. And whatever I can do to help people understand how serious the subject is, and how we should all be taking it more seriously. It has a potential to bring us together. So many of us who come from very different backgrounds have very different beliefs, are in fractious political relationships with each other. Let's face it, America has not been on tougher times in terms of people seeing each other as the enemy than we are now since maybe the Civil War, and that concerns so many of us. This subject has the potential to bring us together and see ourselves as human beings first, with a lot more in common than we have separating us.
I think I heard Ronnie Reagan say something like that a while ago at the
1987, 45th meeting of the General Assembly, one of the most interesting series of presidential remarks on the subject, slightly veiled, ever.
Yeah. Well, I will probably see you up in Exeter.
I
As you
look
know, I'll
forward to
probably
it,
be the
Matt.
one stuck running the audiovisual part of things.
It'll be great to hang out with you again, brother.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing you and obviously hearing, the great speakers that we've got coming up there and stuff. Now, would you like to plug your show?
I am a host of a radio show as well, and it's an old-fashioned radio show that I guess the moment it finishes and goes into the archive of KGRA radio station out of Utah, it becomes a podcast. And that is Meanwhile Here on Earth from 7 to 9 Eastern Standard Time every Monday. You can watch it live at no cost by going to kgradb.com. The DB standing for digital broadcast.
Yep.
And click on I guess it's live stream at the top of the page. Otherwise, you can listen to past shows on Spreaker.com. And Matt is going to be a guest coming up in the next few months, I'm delighted to say.
Yep. Glad to join you.
I'm very proud of the show and hope you'll become listeners to it as well.
I definitely look forward to being on it and spending a couple hours, catching up. It was nice to catch up here, and I am sure that we'll have you on again. Or I don't necessarily want to speak for Tim. It's his show, but I'm pretty sure you wouldn't mind having you on again in the future.
I hope so. Tim knows to send me the usual $10,000 check, and I'm all his.
You're a great guest. Yeah, 10,000. I thought with inflation it'd go up to 15, but you know how that goes.
I know.
It's a month.
I think I was abducted.
I was going to say that's why we're in this subject.
Yeah. I'm sorry I was gone. I think I was abducted there for a couple minutes. And
welcome back.
Brought back. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome back to your show. Thank you for
welcome back to my show. Yeah. Anyways, I want to thank everybody who participated online. I want to thank everybody on the panel, especially Peter Robbins and Matt Moniz, for coming this evening. Thank you both. I want to thank everybody who participated in the chat room as well. And thanks goes out to X1 or Nick Williams for the $2.22 super sticker. I really appreciate it. Next week, we have an interview with UFO Jane. She's an up-and-coming UFO researcher in what I call the new school of UFO researchers that are becoming more and more active. Yes. So Jane, Texas. Yeah, Jane Kyle. She's going to be next week. So hope you can all attend. And from myself and everyone on the panel, we want to say thank you for coming and good evening.
Woo-hoo.